Thank you for inviting me. Some of you will recall visiting the archive room at the Hydrographic Office in Taunton in 2014. Afterwards, you kindly encouraged me to write an article about its resources, which is available in Sheetlines 102. I first need to thank Adrian Webb at the Hydrographic Office for all his encouragement and advice, and also to acknowledge the use of my material from the National Library of Scotland and the National Archives. I shall address our theme in chronological order, discussing details of hydrographic techniques as we go along. I was a civil engineer. My knowledge of surveying was limited, and I have no experience of hydrography, so please question my conclusions at the end of this talk if you wish. Now we come to the first changeover. That's it. Let's set the scene at the beginning of the 19th century. This is one of the charts from Cornwall to the North Sea, completed by the private sector hydrographer, Joseph Foss Dessieux. He was the first person to make good use of the Trig survey of southern England, which had been published by the Ordnance, and he has shown this on his chart. The Ordnance also published the latitudes and longitudes of many of the coastal landmarks. On the other hand, as I hope Andrew Cook will agree, the role of the Admiralty hydrographer was limited to compiling existing surveys, and Alexander Dalrymple had no authority to commission new work. Graham Spence, the Admiralty surveyor, seems to have been a law unto himself, and he made little use of Ordnance figures until 1808, after his retirement. For this chart of the Essex coast, published in 1804, Graham Spence chose not to use the latitudes and longitudes available from the Ordnance. For the 1-inch map of Essex, published at much the same time, the Ordnance chose to use much earlier hydrographic information from Fedon's map of Kent. So it is surprising to find the Ordnance stamp on this copy of Spence's chart. The comparison between the chart on the left and the copy on the right shows that it's a faithful copy, apart from the omission of Spence's sailing instructions. The extracts on the screen may at first look inconsistent, but this arises only because Spence made a sharp distinction at low water line, whereas the copy on the right makes a much sharper distinction at the high water line. That makes the estuaries look different. But it suggests that this copy was made by Ordnance draftsmen, although there's no evidence that it was put to use by the Ordnance. Effective collaboration began after 1811, when William Fedon, who had engraved the diagrams for the Ordnance papers, republished their accounts of the initial triangulations in 3 volumes. For another 30 years, the Admiralty hydrographer's letterbook show his maritime surveyors asking for copies of the 3 volumes and making good use of the positions shown on this diagram. As we shall see in a couple of minutes, Ordnance stations observed in the south of Scotland were the first to be used for the survey of the fourth estuary by George Thomas, the Admiralty surveyor in home waters. George Thomas was the son of a destitute tailor, and he had been educated at Christ Hospital Charity School. This is significant because the masters of the mathematical schools at Christ Hospital and at the Portsmouth Naval Academy shared the composition and the updating of the Admiralty textbook, Elements of Navigation, shown on the screen. This collaboration fostered almost a fraternity between commissioned surveyors from the upper classes and warranted surveyors from the working classes that existed long before NCOs became respected in the Ordnance. This common culture also triggered the remarkable progress of George Thomas, who in 1811, after serving less than 5 years in the Navy, was appointed to command the Admiralty's first purpose-built surface survey vessel. Now, George Thomas had been apprentice on a whaler at the age of 15 and shipwrecked in the Pacific and disappeared from sight for 9 years until in 1806 he was captured by a British frigate off Montevideo from an American vessel trading with the Spanish. Fortunately, the frigate's captain, the second son of an earl, was also well regarded as a hydrographer. Finding a pupil of Christ's Hospital among his captives, Bouverie very soon rated him as a master's mate, and Thomas immediately commenced this logbook that remarkably survives in the National Archives. After the minimum requirement of 2 years, Bouverie backed Thomas for a master's warrant. In the following year, after taking part in the Auckland expedition, Master Thomas had the temerity to submit his chart of the Scheldt directly to the Admiralty Board. This impressed Thomas Hurd, now the Admiralty hydrographer, and several captains in the hydrographic fraternity secured Thomas's appointment as Admiralty Surveyor in home waters. Sorry, going on too fast. Previous. This survey of the Firth of Forth was completed in 1815. You can see how George Thomas was able to create his more detailed triangulation from the Ordnance Point intersected Loch Lomond, East Lomond, and Largo Law. So you may not be able to read the depths on the chart, you can see the multitude of his soundings. His straight lines are not trig bearings, but sight lines with instructions to guide navigators clear of rocks and shoals. Here is a detail of his chart, and you can see the intersected points at North Berwick Law and Bass Rock. The detailed pictures on the shoreline denote additional triangulation points secured by Thomas that enabled him to plot his offshore soundings in the manner we shall discuss later, and provided the basis for the sight lines I have just mentioned. 2 years later, Marcel Biot from the French Academy joined an ordnance group on an expedition to extend their triangulations to the Shetlands and to observe the frequency of a pendulum as a means of measuring lengths of degrees of latitude. Colonel Mudge had expressed a high opinion of George Thomas, which made sense for the expedition to sail in George Thomas's survey brig Investigator. But unfortunately, Mudge had to delegate his leadership of an ill-assorted party in a cramped vessel to the impatient Major Colby. On their arrival in Balta Sound, the Ordnance set up camp on Balta Island, whereas Marcel Biot preferred the hospitality of the Edmondson family at Bowness on the Inner Sound, to whom he later presented the miniature on the screen. This shows the scene when, this watercolor was actually painted in the following year. It shows the scene on 9th September 1817, when Biot's diary records him observing, timing his pendulum at Bowness at the very time that Thomas's logbook records Colby's departure from the Sound. Biot was left to make his own journey home, and in Edinburgh he allowed the Caledonian Mercury to express no small degree of surprise that we have learnt that this eminent philosopher was entirely abandoned by the gentleman who was sent to accompany him on his expedition. While you get accustomed to this projection, let me explain that the 3D views I have taken from the National Library of Scotland provide a convenient way to show north-south diagrams in landscape format. This one shows the outcome of the more successful expedition in a larger survey brig over 6 months in 1821. This enabled Colby with 2 officers, 19 artillerymen, and the 36-inch Theodolite to observe his previous stations on the mainland from the Orkneys and to use the convenient stepping stones of Fair and Vula to link up with his observations at Bolter. In the following year, the Admiralty again supported a very successful ordnance expedition that seems to be recorded only in the 1858 report on the principal triangulation and a contemporary report, again in the Caledonian Mercury, that Major Colby was embarking from Greenock for Islay on Her Majesty's cutter Bat. From 5 new stations on the inner islands, they extended the previous triangulation, shown in yellow, to intersected points as far apart as South Uist, Ben Nevis, and Northern Ireland. That glimpse of Ireland provides the opportunity to recognise a major omission from this talk. From 1824 onwards, Colby and most of his officers were diverted to a comprehensive survey of Ireland. After a few years, this came to include collaboration with the hydrographers, as summarised on the slide. I cannot pretend to have studied this work in detail, but my impression is that this relationship was in many ways more systematic and more successful in Ireland than it was in Britain. But I apologise, that is all I have to say about Ireland. Unlike Graham Spence, George Thomas made very good use of the ordnance triangulation in all of the places shown on the slide. His meticulous calculation books show him checking the ordnance calculations, especially for the intersected stations on the Essex coast that provided the basis for his offshore surveys in the Thames approaches. When he was dispatched to the Suffolk coast, the ordnance trig had reached only as far as Orford Ness, so he had to construct his own baseline for the Suffolk coast, which we'll see in a moment. But first, here are the instruments used by Thomas and other maritime surveyors. The Theodolite was used on land in just the same way as the ordnance would have triangulated a chain of coastal stations. The surveying compass, or the sextant used horizontally, was used to fill in between these coastal stations. Obviously, the line was used to take soundings and identify the nature of the seabed. The interesting instrument is the station pointer, which was used to locate the position of soundings taken from a moving vessel in a way that we should discuss in a moment. On the coast of Suffolk, you can see in purple Thomas's triangulation between the church steeples of Suffolk, which provided the only useful markers. This was, I think, the earliest chart made available to the Ordnance, although not the first to be used by the Ordnance. Note that Thomas's caption mentions his assistant master and the midshipman on board. This was in accordance with the hydrographic tradition of giving credit where it was due, or presumably the contrary. Now for the station pointer. Whereas the Ordnance would normally fix a position from 2 angles at each end of a baseline, the surveyor at sea with his sextant used horizontally recorded 2 adjacent angles between 3 known points on the shore. Returning to his chart table, to avoid a nasty simultaneous equation, he set the observed angles on his station pointer and located his position by setting this on his draft chart and jiggling the instrument into the one possible position. Incidentally, George Thomas in 1844 was still using the station pointer he had inherited from Graham Spence in 1810, which he wrote could be set to 1 angular minute. Such was the power of the vernier scale. This extract from Thomas's chart shows his soundings and the submarine contours he interpolated from those. You can see that these were faithfully copied on the Ordnance 1-inch map on the right, published some years later, but unfortunately spoiled, in my view, by the pointless fashion of waterlining. By reference to a later Ordnance 6-inch map, the difference in the coastal treatment seems to be explained by a very different treatment of the coastal dunes by the Ordnance, and they did not seem to take much notice of Thomas's tidelines. Now, this is George Thomas again, and I mentioned his sightlines. He still provides a tiny picture of his landmarks, but note that he also marks their position with a dot in a circle. So these were carefully observed points, and they provided the basis for a sightline for mariners to avoid shoals and other hidden features. This one extends in blue out over the sea to mark the northern boundary of the hidden sandbank off Aldborough. Thomas's instruction tells the navigator, for as long as he can see the inland church to the right of there's the inland church, provided he can see that to the right of the coastal home, he is sailing safely north of the sandbank. Now we're going from Suffolk north to the Wash, and Hewitt's chart of the approach to Boston was made later than the Suffolk chart, but used sooner by the Ordnance. Note that Hewitt's low water line and the intertidal watercourses were copied faithfully on the 1-inch sheet. But look at the Freeston shore, enlarged in the northern border. Sorry about that, there it is. Our secretary, Rob Wheeler, has described this in Regency times as the Brighton of the Fens. The 1-inch map shows a track from high water to low water, presumably for bathing machines, but note that this was ignored on Hewitt's chart. The omission is interesting, as it was sometimes debatable who was responsible for surveying between the high and low water marks. Hewitt's omission cannot be attributed to the absence of the track when he made the chart, as this part of the 1-inch map made in 1831 matches the Ordnance Surveyor's drawing made in 1815. There's the track. This example almost justifies Colby's rather disparaging comment to Beaufort that he needed hydrographic assistance only with the mapping of the intertidal mudbanks. Now we go to the other side of the country and take it slowly while you absorb the different coloring of the maps. In 1825, Captain White in Shamrock was cooperating with the Ordnance surveyors in the Bristol Channel. A few years later, we can see a perfect match between the hydrographic detail on White's chart and the Ordnance 1-inch sheets for Cardiff and Bristol. However, the Lord High Admiral in 1827 ruled against attempts to cooperate at the same time and in the same place. Instead, he said, the Ordnance should provide their coastline for the maritime surveyors to add the low water line and relevant information. By 1830, it was becoming more difficult to harmonise the survey programmes, and in 1831, Beaufort appointed Admiralty Hydrographer. In 1828, simply instructed Denham from time to time to supply the low water line to the Ordnance. Pause for a drink. White, Thomas and Hewitt had commanded Admiralty sailing brigs. But when Lieutenant Slater was dispatched to the Northumbrian coast in 1828, he was required to find and pay for hired boats, as well as local labour, lodgings and horses, all within agreed budgets. Worse still, good survey weather was often good fishing weather, and the letter books record Slater having to make alternative deals with harbour masters, coastguards and fishery protection vessels. As steam tugs became available for hire, he and others had to justify the cost of coal against the savings in survey time. And later, they had to compete with other Admiralty priorities to secure the use of steam paddle vessels. This is in Northumbria. Slater had been provided with an ordnance triangulation, but he lacked confidence in the ordnance position for Tynemouth, subsequently corrected by the ordnance, and he found other stations difficult to find. So Slater obtained two sides of a triangle and the included angle from the ordnance as above, and he used this to provide his baseline, shown below, for his own triangulation of the Northumbrian coast. This is part of his fair copy, the term adopted for the final draft of a chart submitted for Beaufort scrutiny before being engraved for publication. You should be able to see Slater's triangulation across the top of the chart on the southwest, and across the lower side on the northeast, you can see his lines of soundings plotted at close intervals. I compared the street plan with contemporary maps on the Library of Scotland website and concluded that the street plan was probably made by Slater or his team. Here is a closer view. You can now see the numbered coastal stations plotted from his trig network. 19 stations, station 1, station 2, station 3, 19 stations over 10 miles of coast. Note that he also plotted a useful back row of marker stations, there they are, on the Great North Road. We know from his correspondence with Beaufort that between the numbered coastal stations, Slater placed what he called sextant stations next to the coastline at intervals of 50 to 150 paces. From these, he could mark in the high and low tide lines and offshore features. I puzzled over the grid that you can see on this and other fair copies and concluded that the scale was unimportant and it was added later for adjusting the scale of the diagram for copying. When I say the scale was unimportant, it was adjusted so as to provide a whole number of squares between two marker points. Beaufort had been asking for coastal views, intended for navigators to find their position by aligning coastal features with distant landmarks. Slater surely made a good impression with this panorama of Montrose. The upper version is about 6 inches across and with half-inch squares and a graticule of 1/12 of an inch. The lower version is the work of the engraver in the margin of the published chart on the NLS website. Incidentally, I am not showing many published charts today, as you can study the Scottish ones at least on the NLS website. Now we're 3/4 of the way through, if you're worried, and we go on to a close-up of the Montrose Panorama. Just pause for a moment to admire the detail. Graticule 1/12 of an inch. How did he manage to draw that from 2 miles offshore? Now, let's talk about projections, because in 1833, Beaufort got worried about the problem that the Ordnance used what was known as a Cassini projection, whereas the Admiralty, for good reasons, used a Mercator projection. Please forgive me for repeating that an observed trig network is composed of spherological triangles, whoever does it. These were recalculated by the Ordnance to comprise networks of plane triangles. Importantly, these networks were not planar, but each was part of an irregular polyhedron, the surface of an irregular polyhedron with vertices on the Earth's spheroid. As you know, in whatever manner such a network is projected on a flat sheet, something must get distorted. The problem was that the Ordnance used Cassini to plot distances correctly on and perpendicular to the meridian, whereas Beaufort wanted the hydrographers to adjust the Ordnance triangulation by plotting angles correctly relative to any meridian. This would have caused trouble, but Slater found a simpler way ahead. He had argued with Beaufort over the scales and sheet lines adopted in Northumbria. So on the eastern coast of Scotland, Slater recorded his coastal surveys on a series of fair copy sheets as marked in red. Each of these extended over about 10 minutes of latitude at a scale of 4 inches to the nautical mile. Each was triangulated between stations near the ends of the sheet, for which latitudes and longitudes were provided by the Ordnance or interpolated by Slater from Ordnance stations, as shown on the slide. Over this distance, differences between Cassini, Mercator, and the curved surface of the Earth are insignificant. For inland relief and offshore soundings, for which precise accuracy was less important, Mercator plotted at 1 inch to the nautical, Slater plotted his work at 1 inch to the nautical mile on the sheet lines shown in purple. The published charts, sheet lines shown on the right, extended over nearly 1 degree of latitude at a scale of approximately ½ an inch to the nautical mile. And I deduce that the Admiralty engraver started by drawing a Mercator grid. Then he must have pinpointed each pair of trig stations as adopted at the end of each end of a fair copy. Then he could resolve the projection issue simply by scaling each of the fair copies independently between their respective trig points on his engraving. This patchwork approach dealt with the problem, silenced Beaufort's concerns, and was followed by Slater's successors. Now we go to the other side of the country. The merchants of Liverpool and Glasgow had been pressing for an Admiralty survey of the approaches to their ports. Colby at first resisted Beaufort's entreaties to change his trig programme. But in 1834, extra treasury funding was provided for Captain Alexander Henderson, supported by half a dozen sappers. Within 12 months, amazingly, he completed a new survey of the Isle of Man, and he compiled 2 massive trig diagrams of the west coast of England and of the Irish Sea that were put to good use by the maritime surveyor Lieutenant Robinson to satisfy the merchants of Carlisle and Greenock, as well as Glasgow. Henderson went on from this work over the next 5 years to complete detailed triangulations of the Solway and the Clyde. But in 1840, he was posted to South Africa, unfortunately, never to return. Now, the Irish Sea was surveyed by Captain Beechey, while other surveyors worked in hire boats along the coasts. He was provided with a steam vessel and sounding machines to survey the middle of the Irish Sea. Beechey had considerable experience in the Pacific and obviously understood projections, and it was now his job to put the work together in a chart of the Irish Sea on Mercator's projection. Seeking to base this on latitudes and longitudes provided by the Ordnance, Beechey could not reconcile their latest figures with those previously published in 1811. Note the courtesy with which Beaufort then approached Robe, 2 ranks his junior and overloaded with work. The disparities identified by Beechey must have arisen from the difference between the figure or dimensions of the Earth adopted by the Ordnance in 1811 and Airy's figure of the Earth published in 1830, as discussed in sheet lines 119. It is clear from the figures that Robe and Henderson had each independently, by 1834, adopted Airy's figure of the Earth. We can only guess whether Colby's temporary embargo that he relaxed in 1837 reflected a state of ignorance or of denial. Coming back to the east coast of Scotland, Slater had worked up the east coast as far as Cromarty, where in 1841 he met with a more courteous response to the disparity between his calculations and the Ordnance longitude and latitude for Cromarty Spire, which appears here from one of Slater's coastal views. Yolland at the Ordnance very soon re-examined the observations made previously, and to his credit, promptly referred Slater's figures to Captain Beaufort himself. Beaufort's letter to Slater may seem rather unkind to the Ordnance, but he needed at that time to boost Slater's morale. Now, the provision of an Ordnance position for Cromarty Spire is interesting because the Trig Survey of Northern Scotland, as documented by Alexander Ross Clark in 1858, gives the impression that in 1819 and 1839, this was confined to primary stations, those shown in colour on the plan. But since accepting this assumption in sheet lines 98, I found this interesting plan at Kew that shows that Colby also intersected a number of secondary stations in the surveys of 1819 and 1839. This makes the amazing distances that he covered on foot in 1819, as reported in the Ordnance history, appear all the more impressive. 1,100 miles, they reckoned, over 2 journeys, each of 22 days. And we fitted the secondary observations in at the same time. This is the first page of the Trigg book that survives from Lieutenant Otter, who succeeded Slater in 1842 after Slater's death near Thurso. In this case, the record is complete because Beaufort's letterbook shows how they notified positions for Ben Hootit and Rowan Island from the Ordnance to the hydrographer. The situation at this time was now that the provision by the Ordnance of the latitude and longitude of strategic trig stations provided the necessary and sufficient means of collaboration between the Ordnance and the Admiralty. And for the final slide, we come back to the northwest coast. Otter's baseline stations appear on this extract from the previous diagram in red. The hamlet of Erriboll is interesting because in the 1841 census, Alexander Ross Clark, aged 12, can be found living with his grandmother in Erriboll. He was the author of the stupendous compilation of the Trigg Survey in 1858. And I like to think that he was inspired by meeting up on the road with Colby's team in 1839 or Otter's team in 1844. So to conclude, Colby's trigonometrical survey, despite the shortcomings I have mentioned, was of great value to the Admiralty hydrographer in completing his surveys of the British coastline. The Admiralty provided some useful transport in return, but it is not entirely convincing that the offshore hydrography was of considerable value to the Ordnance maps. Thank you very much. I hope we're to time, and I welcome any questions or discussion.
Well, David, thank you very much indeed. What a wonderful presentation and perfect timing too. And with such a distinguished audience as we had today, I've no doubt there'll be some interesting comments and questions coming forward. I can almost sense Andrew Cook thinking up something for us. But what a wonderful selection of graphics. Thank you so much. Everything from those beautiful brigs like Beagle, wonderful etchings, presumably. And the other thing that struck me between the eyes was those Boston sandbanks as well. Were they really the same place? It's amazing to compare the OS with the HO. And I commend your wonderful graphics combining the 3D views of particularly Scotland and the Irish Sea, of course, with the triangulations. I thought that was a brilliant way of showing them. And thank you very much. I'm almost in such a sacred place. I'm almost about to say the score so far is OS 0. Hydrographic Office 1. But David, thank you so much. If anyone has any questions, please fire away. I think you can. David, are you leaving your shared screen on, or would you like people to appear?
I think it's still on at the moment because I've got one or two other slides that might be useful in answer to questions, but what's the best thing to do? Shall we put it off for now?
Okay, it's just, no, I'll change my view so that I can hopefully see everyone. Well, put it off for now and we can come back to it. I think that is simplest, yeah.
Let's see if we can get rid of it. Take it slow.
That's
Screen
better.
sharing has stopped. Okay.
That's better
That's
because
it.
we still have 50 people with us. So thank you
Well,
very
that's
much.
good.
And if everyone would like to go to your bottom right somewhere button.
I'm really pleased with 51 out of 62 staying with us. Thank you very much.
It's absolutely riveting. I think if everyone like to go to reactions, now we can see you all. You can click on a thumbs up. So I'm demonstrating one, and then treat that as applause, David. That's the best. The best that Zoom can do. Lots of thumbs up here today. Anyone have any questions, please, for David?
Andrew Cook.
Told you.
No surprise.
And David, that was absolutely fascinating. You've explained to me in the course of 40 minutes something I'd been wondering about for some time, which is why the Admiralty published charts of the inland waters of Ireland, Loch Erne, Loch Ness, in the 1830s and 40s. And I think it will be excellent if the work that you're doing was carried forward into showing how this exchange of information materialized on published charts in that very seminal period between about 1837 and 1846, when there was an immense amount of publication by Beaufort, which I now see in the case of Ireland and also in the case of Robinson on the west coast of England, resulted from this interaction. And one comment I'd like to make is that every time I leave Scrabster Harbour to go to Orkney on the Hamnavoe, I'm always thinking of Slater falling to his death while surveying the headlands around the bay there. It's very sad because Slater was, because of his untimely death and his replacement by Otter has gained much more fame in hydrographic circles. But you're rehabilitating Slater, and I congratulate you for it. And thank you very much for your lecture this morning. No real question, but I wanted to make those comments. You don't mind, do you?
I'm very grateful to Andrew for his comment. And I can add a bit about Slater because what I've tried to bring out was the very constructive debate between Slater and Beaufort. It was a subordinate working for a boss who was prepared to listen, and between them working out the best way ahead. And Otter for a long time was Slater's lieutenant, second in command, and I think he followed his example very faithfully. Slater, unfortunately, spent money on a fashionable wife, bought a cutter out of his own money or borrowed money, and left quite a lot of unfinished charts behind him. And he was a worried man when he was at Thurso. The Admiralty have always assumed that he fell from the cliffs. The local people, the Ordnance Survey name map says that he jumped. Yeah, I think I must write up the story a bit more sometime. Thank you.
Thank you, yes.
I love that that letter you did an extract from Beaufort to Slater, pointing out that he'd spotted the error in the ordnance calculations. It was so beautifully put, wasn't it?
Yes.
So that's OS nil HO2, I think, is the score so far. You made Suffolk coast sound so well. It is interesting, of course, but you belie your Suffolk coastal origins there, I think, David.
I refrained from pointing out that the line at the top of the diagram, there's a line from Lowestoft Lighthouse to St Margaret's Church, which was virtually the route I took when I was walking to school in the 1940s.
Wonderful. With your theodolite.
No, I didn't mean, I was in the Cubs. I was in the Cubs, so I
Uh-huh.
must have brought a map.
With a map. Excellent. More questions, please, or comments for Rob? Have you got one?
Yes. As much as a response to you, Jerry, as to David, you were talking about the stability of the sandbanks in the wash. Their behavior is actually quite interesting because they are stable until there's a particularly wet season, and the volume of water coming out of any of those major rivers tends to move, to shift sandbanks. And then it takes a little while for them to settle down again. I say takes, I should say took, because all this ceased when the main rivers had training walls built, which fixed their course much more precisely. So I would assume, and though I can't come up with any firm evidence for this, that you do have stability and then suddenly it changes. If that's any help.
Well, I'm sure David knew it, but it's helped me.
Well, I was hoping that Rob would come up with a picture of the bathing machines, because I did try to tease him with his description of the Freeston shore, the Brighton of the Fens. Any pictures, Rob?
No, I'm afraid I've never come across one, though I can quote a somewhat later quote, I think from the late 1840s, that says, Freeston is not now much frequented, Skegness being thought so much more select.
Very good, very good.
And very bracing. Any more questions or points for David, please? Richard Oliver. Unmute, please, Richard.
If not, I'll have a comment.
Richard, you're on.
Yes, thank you. I'm just tidying myself up a bit. One or two comments, as well as a sort of semi-question. The omission of detail which the OS maps on the foreshore between high and low water marks is something I've noticed on much more recent charts, and could be particularly interesting if you have the sort of channel which goes across, which is particularly like to meet with in the likes of the Wash, or also in the parts of the Humber Estuary, of a channel which is very distinct on the ground, so to speak, and is almost always in water, but which you barely get any hint of on the chart. And it's also partly, no doubt, because the OS insist on showing their geographically ludicrous medium water does appear on OS mapping. As for Freeston Shore and Skegness and Selectness, I've visited Freeston Shore a few times, and it's definitely more select than Skegness. I've been the only person there. It may say something. More of a sort of comment question. You referred to the transformation from Cassini to Mercator being carried out with the engraver. I wonder if this would not have been carried out by a draftsman who was preparing a draft for the engraver, and that the particular draft has been lost. I don't know if any particular comment on that. I think this sort of touched on a private email exchange we've had recently on missing Ordnance intermediate documents.
Yes, we're talking now about the hydrographic documents, and we have a very good collection of the fair copy chart that went from the Maritime Surveyor to the Hydrographic Office but I have never found any material to show the intermediate process that got that information onto the engraving or whatever the process was later on. So yes, I'm still trying to understand the use of the grid lines, but I do observe that the grid lines on the draft charts fit very well, in most cases, between the triangulated points. So someone pinpointed the latitudes and longitudes on the draft. Whether it was the great engraver or an intermediary, I just don't know. I'm still here waiting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
Yeah.
Where's the chairman?
Chair is muted if he's speaking.
Muted.
I'm listening.
You're on
I'm
mute.
not hearing.
Jerry, you need to unmute yourself.
I'm sorry, it's failing to do it. Is that done it now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
I'm so sorry. I'm only being a ringleader, really. Fascinating conversation there. I'm just encouraging everyone to unmute themselves and shout if you have another point or question for David. I've just put as well his email into the chat, so you can, taking the details from his last slide there. David's willing, I think, aren't you, David, to take any emails later on, which might follow after this meeting and strike you between the eyes just as we finish off. But either give me a vigorous wave in video or unmute and shout if you have any more points for David.
May I comment on what David has just said about the lack of an intermediate drawing between the surveyor's fair copy and the engraved chart? Am I being heard?
Yes.
You are. I can hear you, Andrew.
Fine, thanks. Given the particular aptitude of engravers who had the job of copying from fair drawings in reverse using mirrors, I think with you that it's highly unlikely that the engraver did the transfer. I think there must be a missing fair copy produced by a draftsman. But when fair copies go into engravers' hands, and the people who commission the engravings are very satisfied with the product on the copper plate, the fate of the intermediate drawings is sometimes very difficult to ascertain, and they often go lost.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, Andrew. David, did you want to respond to that? Otherwise, Frank Idiols has raised a hand. Take it away, Frank.
Yeah, I was very interested in your comment about the sextant. I've never thought, I've got a sextant, funny enough, but
yeah.
I've never thought of using it on its side. And of course, the big advantage is you get both views of both targets at the same time. Whereas with a theodolite, you have to put one on and then you turn it into the other, which I suppose is important on a moving boat. Is that I was just, the point was that I'd never thought of that, and it seems sort of quite logical. Thank you.
Yes, it takes you by surprise when you first hear the phrase, but then it falls into place. And moreover, Beechey had a double sextant, so he could observe two angles between 3 points at the same time.
Right, so that would be the pointer was doing that. The actual physical device.
The pointer came later. So he had a double sextant, with numerous mirrors or prisms on it.
Mm.
Using the double sextant, he observed 2 angles between 3 points. And then later on, he set those angles on the station pointer.
Yeah, it's excellent. I don't think my sextant would do that. I can only get. I've got just a single split mirror. That's what the sextant.
Yes.
does.
Well, you
But-
can practice for us and report
Okay.
back. Thank you very
I'll
much.
put another mirror on top.
Yeah, you can practice. Thank you.
And
Thank you.
the great advantage, as any sailor knows, is you're doing it sideways, you don't capsize the boat.
Further to Frank's point,
Especially offside. Sorry, who's speaking? Richard?
Rob Wheeler,
Rob, sorry.
if I may.
Take it away.
Further to Frank's point, I understand, or I seem to recall, that the Prussian state surveys of the late 18th century were triangulated using sextants,
Really.
presumably in that way. So if Frank wishes to practice, all he needs to do is a little triangulation somewhere.
Yes, yes. I'll get it out of his box sometime and try it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Frank. Andrew Cook, you have a point?
Oh, I'm trying to unmute. Thank you.
You have, thanks.
The use of the horizontal sextant was popularized by Dalrymple to start with in his essay on maritime surveying. The advantage of it for him was if he found an observation point and he could measure the angles between all observed features, all he had to do was to make sure that those measured angles added to 360 degrees, and then he knew that his observations were self-correcting.
Yes.
And that's one of the distinct virtues of using the sextant horizontally, because you can sum the angle.
Yeah. Yes.
And I guess you can turn it over as well, like you would do with Theodolite. You take right face, left face. You could actually do the same with a sextant. You could turn the whole thing over and get, correct your angle as well.
Yep.
On a single angle, that's.
That's good. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Andrew.
Yeah, thank you both. Any more questions? The easiest way for me anyway is to go to reactions towards the bottom right of your screen and click on raise hand, and then you leap immediately into my vision here. So any more questions for David?
Chairman, I'm willing to carry on, but I think we ought to say thank you to 46 participants who have stayed with us. It's very much appreciated.
Well, I think let's on that point. I think let's put another thumbs up and say thank you for David, or even unmute and clap. Why not? Live dangerously. Thank you, David.
Good, very good.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Great opportunity.
You've put a lot of work into that, I know, and brilliant graphics, and the technical effort has not been too easy. So that's been great stuff. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you for your attendance of the AGM.